Nolan and Wyatt's dad had a secret friendship that we weren't even in.
Yeah, they were like best friends.
We would go over to Wyatt's house, and Nolan, we would all be in the backyard, whatever, doing something, and Nolan would be inside on the couch with Wyatt's dad, and they would just be cutting it up all night.
Yeah.
A phone can be just a phone. A boat can be just a boat. A text message can be nothing more than a text message sent between people who are trying to help a grieving family. And a video can be nothing more than a few seconds captured on the water during a chaotic holiday weekend.
I bet you $1,000,000 if it was 5 black boys and 1 white boy on the boat. By now, there would have been an arrest, there would have been a warrant, there would have been a seizure, but because America doesn't believe that Black Lives Matter, they trying to act offended because we want to ask the question, what happened to our brother?
Well, we actually have proof that Grandpa Jerry was actually on Horns Island as well, which makes sense why he was able to call the captain, because he physically was watching. And now who was Wyatt on the phone with? Well, we know he was on the phone with Cito Call, but let me show you Grandpa Jerry.
White-haired old man. Look, I just want you.
And she also gave us a little specialty on Wyatt. And
But sometimes, when someone disappears and the answers do not arrive with them, ordinary things suddenly become extraordinary. Every phone call becomes something people want explained. Every movement of a boat becomes part of a timeline. Every text message gets reread. Every missing minute becomes important. And every video frame becomes something people freeze, enlarge, replay, and question. That is what has happened in the case of Nolan Wells. Nolan was 18 years old when he went to Horn Island during the 4th of July weekend, expecting what should have been an ordinary day on the water with people he knew. Instead, he never came home. His body was recovered 2 days later, and according to the material surrounding the case, the circumstances of his final hours have continued to generate questions from his family, commentators, and members of the public. The central question sounds simple, almost painfully simple. What happened to Nolan Wells during those final hours on the island? But the deeper the timeline is examined, the more complicated that question becomes. There are 2 boats. There are different accounts of who was where. There are phone calls involving people connected to the group. There are text messages between Nolan's mother and Warren. There is a video showing a boat in distress, but questions have been raised about what the video does and does not show. There are questions about life jackets, about the absence of audio, about the circumstances surrounding the towing arrangements, and about why certain information was or was not available when the public expected it. There are also questions surrounding Nolan's phone and what investigators may or may not have done with evidence during the early stages of the case. And underneath all of it is a grieving family asking for something that should never be unreasonable, an explanation of what happened to their son. But there is another layer to this story, and that is the question of race. Nolan was black, while most of the people described as being with him that day were white. That fact alone proves nothing about how Nolan died, and it should never be presented as proof that anyone committed a crime. But it became part of the public conversation because Nolan's family and supporters questioned whether his case was receiving the urgency, transparency, and accountability that they believed it deserved. The result is a story where uncertainty itself has become the central character. Because when the official answers are incomplete, people begin looking at the details. And when enough details appear difficult to reconcile, people start asking the same question over and over again. What are we missing? To understand why those questions became so intense, you have to begin with the place where Nolan's final day unfolded. Horn Island is not a normal neighborhood. It is not a city street where a person can walk into a store, find a police officer, call an ambulance, or simply ask a stranger for help. It is an island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, separated from the mainland by open water. The source material describes it as roughly 5 miles from the Mississippi coast and approximately 11 miles long, with no permanent residents, no hospital, no staffed emergency facility, and limited dependable cell service. That isolation matters enormously when you are trying to reconstruct a disappearance. On the mainland, a missing person can leave behind a trail of cameras, witnesses, traffic signals, stores, phones, vehicles, and public spaces. On an isolated island, the number of people who may know what happened can be much smaller. The people who were physically present can become the timeline. Their memories become the evidence that investigators must compare. Their phone records become potential markers of time. Their boats become moving locations on a map. And when those pieces do not immediately form one clean story, uncertainty expands. On July 4, 2026, Horn Island became a destination for people celebrating Independence Day. The source material describes hundreds of people gathering there, with estimates in the range of roughly 200 to 300 people. Boats arrived, groups gathered. Young people spent the holiday on the beach and around the water. From a distance, there was nothing about the setting that necessarily announced tragedy. It was a holiday. It was summer. People were surrounded by friends, and Nolan Wells was there. According to the material, Nolan was with people he knew, including Warren Hudson, who was described as one of his close friends dating back to 8th grade. Other names appearing in the source include Jack Spatalo, Morgan Seymour, Trace's Tin Shepherd, and Javon Williams. That history matters because this was not described as a random group of strangers. These were people who had shared connections and memories, and yet somewhere between the beginning of that holiday gathering and the moment Nolan disappeared, the ordinary day became a mystery. One of the first details that becomes important is that the group did not travel to the island on a single boat. There were 2 boats. According to the source material, Warren Hudson was associated with a 24-foot tide line, while Nolan was on a separate 22-foot Triton offshore boat. That distinction may sound like a small logistical detail, but in a case built around reconstructing movement, it becomes fundamental. If Nolan and Warren were not on the same boat during the trip to the island, then the exact movements of each vessel become relevant. Who was on which boat? When did each boat leave? When did each boat arrive? Where did each boat anchor? Who moved between them? Who saw Nolan last? And when the boats later became part of the story surrounding the sinking incident, which people were actually aboard each vessel at each stage? Those questions are not accusations. They are simply the questions required to build a reliable timeline. According to the source, the 2 boats traveled independently toward the same destination. For several hours, there was no obvious sign that anything catastrophic was about to happen. The island was filled with the normal sounds of a holiday gathering, but then the timeline began to fragment. One of the source documents reportedly described witnesses telling investigators that Nolan had consumed a significant amount of alcohol during the gathering. The same material also says witnesses reported seeing Nolan with a woman identified as Katie McCormack. It is important to separate those reports from conclusions. The document described in the source was not presented as a final determination of what happened to Nolan. It was an early communication associated with search efforts. It showed what information authorities had received at that point, not necessarily what investigators ultimately concluded. And that distinction is critical. In a case like this, an early witness statement can become one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it cannot automatically answer the entire puzzle. What did Nolan consume? How much? At what time? Who saw him? What condition was he in later? Who was with him? Where did he go after that? These questions become important because the last confirmed moments of a missing person often determine the direction of an investigation. And then there is the question that changes everything. When did people realize Nolan was missing? A day at an island gathering can contain hundreds of small movements. Someone goes to the beach, someone gets on a boat, someone walks away, someone calls a friend. Someone changes locations. In a crowd, a person can disappear from view without immediately triggering alarm. But once people realize someone is missing, every previous moment becomes important. Suddenly, the question is no longer what Nolan did during the afternoon. The question becomes what Nolan did during his final known period. Who saw him? Where? At what exact time? Was he alone? Was he with friends? Was he near the boats? Was he on the beach? Was he in the water? Was he preparing to leave? Did someone speak to him shortly before he vanished? Did his phone show activity? Were calls made? Were messages sent? Did anyone report seeing him after the group's boats began moving? The source material repeatedly returns to those timeline gaps. That is why the boats matter. That is why the phone matters. That is why the messages matter. And that is why the people who were there matter. When the answer to a death is not immediately clear, investigators are not supposed to choose the most dramatic explanation. They are supposed to reconstruct what can be established, separate fact from assumption, and determine which possibilities survive scrutiny. But for Nolan's family, the problem is that every unanswered question represents another piece of their son's final day that they still cannot fully understand. One person who becomes central to the public discussion is Warren. The source material contains text messages between Nolan's mother, Christine, and Warren. Those messages are important, not because a text message automatically proves guilt or innocence, but because they offer a glimpse into the communication taking place between Nolan's family and someone who had been close to him. One message reportedly asked Warren what kind of sunglasses Nolan wore. Warren responded that he believed they were Ray-Bans. In another exchange, Warren told Nolan's mother that he and others had gone out looking and that he had been on and off the phone with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. He also told her that she should reach out if she needed anything. Later, Christine asked about the boats. According to the source, Warren explained that Nolan had gone out on the 22-foot Triton offshore, while Warren was on the 24-foot tide line. He described the boats as traveling separately and referred to information held by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and the Sheriff's Office. Then came another message. Christine reportedly asked Warren whether he could collect any of Nolan's belongings left at Jack's house. Warren also sent a message expressing sympathy, saying Nolan had been one of his best friends since 8th grade, and that he did not want to become a distraction during the funeral. If you look at those messages in isolation, they can be read as the communication of a friend attempting to support a grieving family. But because this is a case with unresolved questions, people have naturally examined the messages for inconsistencies, omissions, or details that might help reconstruct what happened. That does not mean the messages establish wrongdoing. It means the messages have become part of the record that people are examining. And that distinction matters because there is a dangerous temptation in internet investigations to treat every unusual detail as evidence. A strange sentence can be innocent. A missing detail can have an ordinary explanation. A delayed response can mean nothing. The responsibility is to ask questions without pretending the questions themselves are answers. The Warren messages become even more interesting because they intersect with the broader issue of the timeline. At one point, the source material references a message involving Nolan's father and a key. The family was trying to retrieve Nolan's belongings and determine what had happened. Another exchange apparently involved the location where the group had last been seen. A message references the west tip and north side of Horn Island and asks where the group launched from. Again, these details may appear mundane, but in an investigation involving boats and an isolated island, location is everything. A few hundred yards can change the meaning of a timeline. The difference between one side of an island and another can determine which boat was nearby, which people could have seen something, and how long it would have taken someone to move from one location to another. That is why the question of where the boats launched from matters. That is why the question of where they were anchored matters. That is why the question of where Nolan was last seen matters. And that is why the family has continued to push for clarity. When a loved one dies under circumstances that remain disputed or unexplained, families do not experience the case as an abstract investigation. They experience it as the final chapter of a human life that suddenly ended without a satisfying explanation. Then there is Wyatt. The source material repeatedly asks why the public has heard so little from Wyatt and where his boats were. It also references information that was allegedly missing from an MDMR report. But here again, the responsible way to understand the story is to distinguish the question from the conclusion. The source raises the question of where Wyatt was and why his role has not been fully understood by the public. It does not establish that Wyatt committed a crime. It does not establish that he concealed evidence. It does not establish that his silence has a sinister explanation. Silence can have many explanations. People can avoid public attention because they are grieving, because attorneys advise them not to speak, because investigators tell them not to discuss an active case, or because they simply do not want to participate in an online controversy. But if Wyatt was connected to the events surrounding the boats and phone calls, then his precise movements could still be relevant to reconstructing the timeline. That is the difference between investigation and accusation. An investigator can ask where someone was without assuming why they were there. The public should be able to do the same. And then we reach Cito. According to the source, Cito and Wyatt were connected by phone during a period that also involved another call involving Jerry, Nolan's grandfather, and Captain Seth Ward. This is where the case becomes particularly difficult to follow because multiple calls appear to overlap in the timeline. Who called whom? Why was each call made? What did each person know at the time? What did they believe was happening? And most importantly, what can the phone records independently confirm? A phone call can tell investigators that two devices communicated at a certain time, but the existence of a call does not automatically tell us what was said. That requires additional evidence, such as recordings, witness accounts, or other documentation. The source raises the possibility that the calls could have been routine communication related to towing. It also raises a more suspicious interpretation, suggesting that one call could potentially have been intended to establish an alibi. But that second interpretation remains an allegation or theory, not an established fact. And this is exactly where the story requires discipline. If the question is, why was Jerry on that call? That is a legitimate question. If the claim becomes, Jerry was on that call because he was creating an alibi, that is a conclusion that requires evidence. The distinction may sound small, but it changes everything. Jerry becomes important because the source says he was physically present on Horn Island and later contacted Captain Seth Ward regarding a tow. The reported sequence raises a practical question. If a boat was believed to be in trouble, why was one towing option cancelled? Why did the people involved choose another method of assistance? Was the cancellation simply because another boat was available? Did the people involved believe the situation was under control? Was the boat actually sinking at the moment the call occurred? Or was the situation being interpreted differently by different people? Without the complete communications and timeline, it is impossible to answer those questions confidently. But they are exactly the kind of questions investigators would need to resolve. The public has focused heavily on the idea that Jerry would have wanted a reliable tow if he believed people were in danger. That is understandable, but people do not always make decisions in emergencies that later appear logical. They can underestimate a problem, they can believe a friend can handle it, they can receive information that someone else does not have. They can think a boat is disabled without believing it is actually sinking. That is why the precise timing matters. What did Jerry know when he called? What did he know when the tow was cancelled? What did Wyatt know? What did Cito know? What did the other people on the boats know? The answers could be completely ordinary, or they could reveal something important. The only way to know is to establish the sequence. Then came the video. The sinking boat video has become one of the most discussed pieces of visual material surrounding the case. According to the source, the video shows a boat in distress with multiple people aboard. But commentators have raised several questions about what the video does not show. There is no audio in the version being discussed. The people visible in the video apparently do not appear to be wearing life jackets, and viewers have questioned why, if the boat was truly sinking, everyone did not immediately move onto the other boat or take more obvious emergency measures. There are also questions about the length of the recording. Why does the available video begin where it begins? Why does it end where it ends? Is there more footage? Was the clip edited? Is there metadata that establishes when and where it was recorded? These are reasonable forensic questions when evaluating a video. But there is an equally important caution. The absence of an answer is not proof that the video was staged. People can behave strangely during emergencies. Videos can be recorded in incomplete segments. Metadata can be unavailable for reasons unrelated to deception. And a person who looks calm in a short clip may have been terrified immediately before or immediately afterward. So the responsible question is not, does this prove the video was fake? The responsible question is, what can the original file establish and what cannot it establish? That question leads directly to metadata. Metadata can sometimes provide information about when a file was created, what device recorded it, how it was modified, and other technical details. But the source material says that metadata for the video had not been confirmed publicly. If the original file exists, then its forensic examination could potentially answer some questions. When was it recorded? On what device? Was it modified? Was the version circulating publicly the original? Was the clip shortened? Are there other files from the same device that establish context? Those questions are far more useful than simply watching the video repeatedly and interpreting body language. The source includes commentary about people appearing tense, looking in certain directions, breathing heavily, or behaving in ways that some viewers interpret as suspicious. But body language analysis from a short video is notoriously uncertain. A person can look nervous because they are scared. A person can look calm because they are unaware of danger. A person can look away because something is happening off camera. none of those observations independently establish what happened to Nolan. The stronger evidence would come from synchronized phone records, original video files, GPS information where available, boat electronics, witness statements, and physical evidence. That is how the pieces can either reinforce each other or contradict each other. The life jacket question has also become a major storytelling button because it sounds so simple. If people believed a boat was sinking, why were life jackets not immediately visible? The question has emotional force because it creates an image of danger. But again, there can be multiple explanations. Were life jackets on the boat but not being worn? Were people standing in a location where they were out of frame? Did the occupants believe the boat was not in immediate danger? Did the video capture only a few seconds of a much longer event? Did the people know another boat was nearby? The answers matter. And if investigators have access to the complete footage, communications, and testimony, those answers may be easier to establish than they are for viewers watching a short clip online. The same principle applies to the question of why people did not immediately transfer to another vessel. Perhaps they believed the boat could still move. Perhaps they were already receiving assistance. Perhaps the situation developed gradually rather than suddenly. Or perhaps there is another explanation that has not been made public. Until the original evidence is examined, the public cannot honestly select one explanation and call it proven. The phone is another piece that has attracted enormous attention. The source material describes questions about Nolan's phone and whether law enforcement had seized or fully examined it during the early period of the investigation. In a modern missing person or unexplained death case, a phone can be a digital map of a person's final hours. It can contain calls, messages, photographs, location history, application activity, contact records, and other information. But the phone is also extremely sensitive evidence. Investigators must follow legal procedures when obtaining and examining digital data. A delay in public disclosure does not necessarily mean investigators were hiding something. It may mean the information was subject to legal restrictions, forensic processing, privacy concerns, or other investigative procedures. Nevertheless, from the family's perspective, the question remains powerful. What was on Nolan's phone, and could it help establish his final movements? Did he communicate with anyone after arriving on the island? Did he make a call? Did he receive a message? Did his phone connect to a tower? Was location data available? Did someone else handle the device? Was it recovered with Nolan or separately? Were there deleted messages or other artifacts? The source repeatedly frames the phone as potentially crucial evidence. That makes sense, because a phone can sometimes turn a disputed timeline into a measurable timeline. But again, what the phone contains cannot be assumed simply because people online believe it must contain something dramatic.